Urban Design in the United States by me, Sebastian Kaufman. And my specific question, what are the problems with urban design in the United States, and how can we move forward to fix them? Now, what is urban design? Well, urban design focuses on designing and shaping the physical features of towns, cities, and suburbs. Urban design considers the bigger picture issues of economic, social, environmental value, and social design. Well, why is the United States designed like it is? After the Second World War, the United States and Europe set off on similar paths of automotive-centric redesign. But during the late 1960s, Europe set off on developing public transport while encouraging people to walk, bike, and use said public transportation. Mass motorization also took place much earlier in the United States, mainly brought about by the assembly line. By the mid-1930s, there was a car for every 2 households in the United States. Because of this, cities adopted car-centric road standards much earlier in their development than Europe. And in part, European cities are much older than their American counterparts. Other reasons the United States stayed on this path would be the building of the interstate system signed off by President Dwight D. Eisenhower in the 1950s, government subsidies, which drove down costs and increased demand, and the loss of easily accessible public transportation in the United States, zoning laws, and most importantly, the induced demand fallacy. Now, what is this fallacy, you might ask? In transportation, induced demand is when adding new roads or lanes to an existing road results in more people using the road, making it just as congested as it was before. Take, for example, the Katy Freeway in Houston, Texas. When it was first built in 1960, it was a modest 6 lanes, 3 in each direction. Now, that same highway has 26 total lanes at its widest points. Even with a massive widening in the early 2000s, travel times in the morning increased by 30%, and increased by 55% at night. Why? Because widening does not fix the underlying problem of car dependency, it just amplifies it. Widening creates more demand, not less. According to Robert Caro in The Power Broker, the biography of the master builder of New York City, Robert Moses, during the last two or three years before the entrance of the United States into World War II, a few planners had begun to understand that without a balanced system of transportation, roads would not alleviate transportation congestion, but would aggravate it. Watching Moses open the Triborough Bridge, to ease congestion on the Cranesboro Bridge, open the Bronx-Whitestone Bridge to ease congestion on the Triborough Bridge, and then watching traffic counts on all 3 bridges mount until all 3 were as congested as one had been before. The planners could hardly avoid the conclusion that traffic generation was no longer a theory, but a proven fact. The more highways built to alleviate congestion, the more automobiles would pour into them and congest them, thus force the building of more highways, which would generate more traffic and become congested in their turn in an ever-widening spiral that contained far-reaching implications for the future of New York and on all urban areas, end quote. But why am I interested in this? It's because I believe we could build a better world, and that's what I want to do, quite literally at that. I intend to become a civil engineer. From my research, I've concluded that with the right policies, designs, and revisions of certain zoning laws, we could solve certain problems, especially in American cities. I want to create a better world for future generations to live in. I don't want to sit back and watch the world catch on fire because of climate change or drown in it either. I want to further my understanding of engineering to find solutions, and that's why I've chosen this specific topic for my capstone. My process. I knew that cities in the United States are unsustainable with the way we currently build them, but I wasn't sure why or how. So this brought me to my first stop, Louisiana case. I'm going to give you an example using the mid-sized city of Lafayette. That's anywhere between 40,000 people and like 1 million, I believe. 3 urban designers were called in to help shed light on some of the problems the public works director was having. In Lafayette, at the current spending rates, roads were going bad faster than they could be repaired, and it was even worse underground, pipes, electricals, that kind of stuff. The urban designers gathered as much data as they could, analyzed, and then mapped out all the city's revenue streams by parcel, and then did the same for the city's expensive. The higher block goes, the higher the profit or loss. In here, the green is a profit, and the blue is a loss. To replace all the backlog, all of the tickets, you could say, all the potholes, leaky pipes, not working electricals, it would cost $32 billion. And the tax base of the city only came up to $16 billion. It's nearly double the amount of money the city makes in a year. According to one of the urban designers, Charles Marron, the median house in Lafayette costs roughly $150,000. A family living in this house would currently pay about $1,500 per year in taxes to the local government, of which approximately 10%, or $150, goes to the maintenance of their infrastructure. To maintain just the roads and drainage systems that have already been built, the family in that median house would need to have their taxes increased by $3,300 per year, assuming nothing new is built. But this just barely treads water for the city. The median household income in Lafayette is $41,000. With the wealth that has been created by all of this infrastructure investment, median family living in the median house would need to have their city taxes go from $1,500 per year to $9,200 per year to just take care of what they now have. 1 out of every $5 this family makes would need to go to fixing roads, ditches, and pipes, end quote. This is what's been called a growth Ponzi scheme, according to the article, The Real Reason Your City Has No Money by Urban Redesign Focus Organization Strong Towns. Through a combination of federal incentives, state programs, and private capital, cities were able to rapidly grow by expanding horizontally. This provided local government with all the immediate revenues that come from new growth: permit fees, utility fees, tax increases, sales tax, and in exchange, the city takes on the long-term responsibility of servicing and maintaining all that new infrastructure. The money comes in handy in the present, while the future obligation is, well, pretty long time in the future. In Lafayette, is about 40, 50 years, much farther than the human mind likes to think. That was a lot of numbers. A lot of words and phrases aren't very common, so you may be wondering, like I was, what's a tax base? Oh, there we go. So what's a tax base, or how does the city make or lose money? So how does the city turn a profit? Usually taxes, but in other cases, you have cities making what they can off of utility fees. For example, Burlington makes on average 17% of their money from taxes, 10% of their money comes off of federal and state funding, and the other 73% of revenue comes from other various city incomes, such as utility, user charges, license fees. But this income doesn't always cover the cost of city upkeep. American cities and suburbs are so low density that they lose money because the city infrastructure they need to upkeep is spread out over such a large area that the taxes they collect aren't enough to maintain that same infrastructure. Land doesn't make money. Real estate and personal property taxes do. For example, with 2 acres of land, you could build 10 single-family homes. Let's say there's 2 taxpayers per house, that's 20 taxpayers on 2 acres of land. Well, let's say we build 2 5-story buildings with central garages on that same 2 acres, instead of those single-family homes. Well, that would come out to about 95 units per acre, or 90 units in both. And we say that instead of 2 taxpayers per unit, we have 1. They're apartments. They're usually kind of small. That's 190 taxpayers on that same amount of land, with a parking garage to prevent sprawl. Instead of low-density sprawl that makes up a negative income for the city, you could have higher-density neighborhoods that have more people and have a positive income for the city. But what does a sustainable city practice look like? Well, the 15-minute neighborhood is what it looks like. It looks like this, and this. According to the National League of Cities, the 15-minute neighborhood is an urban planning model where everything a resident needs in their daily life can be accessed within a 15-minute walk or bike ride, rather than making an entire city traversable in 15 minutes. Instead, means designing local areas to have everything a person needs, such as medical help, police, groceries, work, school, and recreation within that radius. Unlike how some conspiracy theories say, 15-minute neighborhood wouldn't restrict you to just that radius. It just means that nearly all of your needs would be met within 15 minutes of your home or less. But what does this all mean? What does it mean in terms of my capstone process? Why did I get this amount of knowledge? Somehow, it required a lot of research. I searched far and wide, came upon many sources, most of which are reliable sources. But a lot of the groundwork for my capstone was done by urban designers, civil engineers, and citizen groups, such as Strong Towns and National League of Cities. These groups are focused on making the American city better, and they provided me with the evidence I needed for it. My process was a reaffirmment of what I already knew, but it deepened my understanding past the base level of American cities are bad to knowing why American cities are as car-dependently designed as they are. I can now more confidently say that American cities are poorly designed, and I now have that knowledge to back that up. Now then, with all this out of the way, it's time to talk about my outcome. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do for my outcome. I wasn't sure if I could make a good outcome with my capstone. So I buckled up and I decided to make an op-ed, or an opinion piece, using all of the research I've done. Once I finish it before the end of the semester, I intend to see if I can get it published, primarily online, as I'm not sure what kind of impact, if any, I got it published in a local newspaper. But who will it affect? It'll affect people like you and me across the United States. and hopefully inspire more people to get involved in their city planning. Because you see, most of the city planning comes from a council level, and not everywhere is as fortunate as Vermont with Town Hall Day. Because we have this kind of a direct democracy in Vermont with our towns. Not a lot of places have that. Usually these meetings take place on non-holidays, not during weekends, Mondays, Fridays, Wednesdays, that kind of stuff. Usually, people like you and me, we work, we have school, we've got jobs. We can't make that. But usually the people who can are retirees, and they tend to vote in the short term. So I intend to inspire more people to get involved in their city planning. I'd like to thank my capstone teacher, Ms. Drew, for carrying me through this, and I'd like to thank my dear friend Simon Robertson for keeping me focused on this. Here are my resources. You can email me if you want to see a bigger list. I know you can't really tell what's here. Thank you for your attention.
So, how would you implement your plan to build all these newer structures?
What was that? I couldn't hear you.
How would you implement your plan to build these newer modern structures that can accommodate more people in smaller spaces?
Well, I mostly intend to get people inspired to start thinking about that kind of stuff. I, myself, eventually, maybe, intend to try and do that, but with this capstone, I intend to inspire people to start thinking about that.
Given that the United States has a largely urban, maybe not largely, but there's a large population in the United States that's already developed, like our major cities, would a way of reducing like traffic would be like maybe improve public transportation as a temporary solution?
Improving public transportation wouldn't exactly be a temporary solution. It'd be more of a long-term solution that could come more quickly than any sort of city planning could come in the United States, what with restrictions and red tape and all that.
So you mentioned higher density housing as, you know, one of the forms of you want people to get inspired by. How would that affect low density areas like Vermont or lesser, like not big cities?
Well, with lower density areas like Vermont, the highest density that I can think of off the top of my head, Vermont, would be Montpelier, St. Johnsbury, and Burlington. These three places have great potential for growth. It's just that we need to see that potential.
How would the change in the buildings and like the implementation of newer, more modern buildings affect historical buildings, and how would you work to maintain historical buildings and places in so many of our cities?
Well, I didn't do a lot of research on modern versus historical buildings, but I can say that making buildings historical is a good thing, but sometimes you have to let new things take its place. I can get things behind the Fairbanks Museum. That should obviously stay if you're to build something new in St. Johnsbury, but some of these buildings have asbestos, they've got lead pipes. Sometimes you just gotta tear stuff down.
I'm curious about urban sprawl and how we would approach solving that problem with like super low density areas like surrounding cities.
Well, with suburban sprawl, it's really hard to tackle because, well, there's always a demand for suburbs. There's always a demand for single-family homes. You can't get rid of that demand. You're going to have suburbs. But what you can do is make them not high density, but anywhere between like medium density, like row homes, like in Boston, or like the big brick flats that you have in New York City. That's kind of like the medium density in between suburb and city that you can kind of build more of, and more people would be willing to move into those, especially if the rent's cheap.
How do you anticipate approaching pedestrian safety in your higher density city proposal?
Well, there's this great thing that they did in Amsterdam where they raised pedestrian crossings in residential areas to sidewalk level and made them essentially pretty big speed bumps for cars. Doing that encourages drivers to slow down. That including building more medians and making four-way crossings smaller. That could definitely improve safety.
How would agriculture or like farming lands be affected by this?
They probably really wouldn't. In fact, they might have more land if you start getting rid of suburbs. There's great examples in China where the city just stops and it's just farmland. That's a good example of, I could say, like, kind of good urban design, because you don't have to have it gradually go from high-rise buildings to farmland. You can just have it go straight there. You don't need to mix anything in. You can just have it go from 30-story buildings to just farmland.
You said you were planning on writing an op-ed. Do you know where you would plan to publish it?
Not exactly, but for me, Strong Towns is a good start because they are a pretty open organization that are open to people publishing on there. You just have to go through a process.
Because in your buildings, it seems like there's a lot more people in smaller spaces. Do you expect to have any sanitation issues?
Sanitation issues? Well, with a modern city, there are certain limitations with the modern city. You do have to build waste management plants, you've got to build sewer outlets, you've got to build all that infrastructure. But with modern standards, sanitation shouldn't be too much of an issue, especially if you're building more housing. That usually helps get people off the street because now they can afford somewhere to live.
You mentioned like a question or two ago that you would have like high rises to farmland. Wouldn't that like kind of affect the pollution of like our food?
Well, the thing is with city pollution is that a lot of city pollution comes from cars, actually. And so the more public transport you build, you mitigate the impact of cars. Because a lot of the sound in city, a lot of the sounds from cities, that's not people, those are cars. Those are tires on the road, those are engines. And in fact, electric vehicles would actually make it worse because they're heavier, which means they're louder. So pollution-wise, there would be you'd need to have some sort of buffer, but you can essentially just go from high rises to farmland.
Earlier in your speech, your presentation, you mentioned climate change. Would congestion pricing, such as what they enacted in New York City, be a way to discourage car use and maybe encourage buildings of these neighborhoods in the long term?
Yes, it most definitely would. I actually saw that Paris is in fact putting in a tax for heavier and larger vehicles to discourage people from buying them, especially in the city. So congestion pricing, taxes, tolls, that kind of stuff can help prevent people from buying cars in cities. And in fact, implementing voter ID cards or like state IDs, federal IDs that you don't need to pay a bunch of money for, like a passport, because otherwise you'd need like a driver's license to go voting. You don't need that if you have some sort of like federal thing. So congestion pricing, taxes, and federal IDs could definitely help with pollution and climate change.